Avik, it is good to have you on the Saving Elephants podcast. It was approximately a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, that the Freedom Conservative Project and its companion statements of principles were launched. I'm wondering, can you just give me an elevator pitch for what was the Freedom Conservative Project? What was the motive for launching it about a year ago?
Well, there were several motives, but the general point was, I think, as most of us who spend our time in this space know, there's been a renewed debate about what conservatism should stand for, and there are people who want to redefine what the American conservative movement stands for, and and we do too, in a sense. We want American conservatism to stand for the eternal principles that it has stood for historically, but refined and evolved to really address the challenges of the moment we live in today and the challenges that we face as a country today. And I think a bunch of us were concerned that that one really important element of American conservatism, which is the American tradition of individual liberty and economic freedom and limited government, constitutional government, that suite of things which we've long thought were essential to American conservatism are not people are not as eager to conserve them on the right as they once were, at least in certain intellectual quarters of the right. And so we felt that it was a bunch of us who got together and worked on this project, that it was important to reassert the value of conserving the American tradition of liberty and constitutional government. And again, making sure that that tradition was being applied to the challenges that we face today. And we drew inspiration from something that took place in 1960 when a bunch of leaders of the conservative movement of that time got together under the banner of Young Americans for Freedom and at Bill Buckley's house in Sharon, Connecticut, and put together a statement of principles that they then published. And many of the signatories of that document went on to be leaders of the conservative movement of the mid to late 20th century. And we thought that would be a good launching point for thinking about what conservatism should stand for in 2023 and beyond. And I think at the time we didn't know if there were others who were interested in this project, but we've been really gratified to see that the response to the statement has been enormous. We have over 250 signatories today, if I'm not mistaken, with many more in queue that I've just got to review, and our colleagues got to get review to look at and add. But we've been gratified by the range of institutions, national organizations, state organizations, different kinds of publications, leading thinkers from a broad spectrum. So there's some people who say, oh, Jeb Bush is a signatory, so you're all just like Jeb Bush types. It's like, no, Jeb Bush is a signatory, but so are people who might consider themselves much more conservative than Jeb Bush. Though Jeb Bush is not some sort of squish, I think that's been overrated. But there's a whole range of people who've signed the thing, and I think representing the full spectrum of what the conservative movement has been and ought to be. And so I think that was one part of it, was to bring that coalition back together instead of simply saying what we're opposing, talk about what we're for. And I think equally important is to really commit ourselves to addressing the specific challenges or gaps or blind spots that the conservative movement has had historically. The conservative movement has not done a great job of addressing the problem of the rising cost of living and constrained economic opportunities for those without a college education. I think we've done some things well in that regard, but not others. We were absent from the field in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. In fact, in some cases, actively antagonistic to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And so we thought it was very important for pro-freedom conservatives to address that gap and say, look, there are policy challenges that arise from centuries of slavery and discrimination that we ought to think about. what is the pro-freedom approach, the pro-equal justice under the law approach to solving those disparities, addressing those disparities. And we really, really have to, above all else, arguably, rededicate ourselves to wrestling the national debt to the ground. Because if we don't, our children will have no future in this country. And so those were three things that we really wanted to emphasize. And in some cases, like I think in the issue of what's an agenda, a blue collar agenda, I think that's an area where our friends in the what they call the new right claim has been missing from the three-legged stool or fusionist conservatism of the 20th century. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I think they are right to say that we should prioritize the challenges of lower and middle income Americans more, and we commit to doing that in the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles. And then there are these two other areas where the new right or the national conservatives are absent from the field: the federal debt, and what are the affirmative steps we should take to address persistent disparities in the opportunities for those who are descended from those who endured slavery and segregation in America. And those are things that we think are really important if conservatism is to be a set of principles that are truly universal, that are committed to and relevant to the lives of every American.
There's a lot of ground to cover there, and I do want to just say as an aside, speaking as a millennial conservative, and I've said this often on this podcast, that to the degree conservatism is going to be a viable force in the future, I think it is necessary we on the right address those more odious elements of how we got civil rights wrong, and the various ways in which, in a recognition that our nation is increasingly diversified. And unless conservatism can appeal to people broader than just, say, Caucasian white men, I'm not saying it's just limited to those, but it is predominantly those, that this is going to be an increasingly losing battle on our hands. So I congratulate you, and I do appreciate that is one of those planks. I said I mentioned that as a sign. We can return to that if you would like, but the statement of principles itself, of course, is 10 principles. I think there are fewer, more boring things you can do on a podcast than list 10 principles, so I'm not going to do that for the listener. I will link to it in the show notes, of course, if you want to read it for yourself. You mentioned the statement of William F. Buckley. I'll just include Buckley. I know there's some other dignitaries there, but the Sharon Statement, if you will, in the 1960s. To what degree is the statement of principles, and I know you've explained that in a sense you're trying to, I don't want to say modernize, but understand where we've come since the 60s as conservatives, hanging on to these timeless truths that don't change, and yet responding to events in real time, trying to understand where might have we got things wrong, or how do we express this in a way that is more salient for today. All that being said, is freedom conservatism essentially trying to repackage the Sharon Statement, or maybe to put it another way, is it trying to revitalize Frank Meyer's old sense of fusionism in language that makes sense for us today, or do you see this as a departure from those earlier movements?
I'd say it's an evolution of those prior movements. So I think, to be pedantic for a minute, and this is probably something you've covered on your podcast, but fusionism and, say, the three-legged stool coalition concept are not exactly the same. So one thing you'll hear people talk about as well, the 20th century post-war American conservative movement was this three-legged stool of the libertarians who particularly held sway on economic policy, the social conservatives who held sway on social policy, things like abortion and cultural things, and then you had the anti-communists on the foreign policy side, and those are the three stools, and that's a different idea, technically speaking, than fusionism, which argues that there's one leg to the stool, in a sense, that people who are virtuous can only have a political concept of virtue if one is politically free to pursue virtue, and vice versa. And that's a Frank Meyer concept that that we can, you could have a whole episode, obviously, and you probably have on that specific topic.
Yeah, incidentally, I did want to interject that I often joke that somewhere out there Stephanie Slade's head is spinning in circles every time somebody says that the three-legged stool is the same as fusionism. So I
Right.
appreciate you making that distinction.
And I bring that up just to say that um, the freedom conservatism statement is designed to represent all of those orientations, right? So hopefully, and I would say in reality, there are libertarians who've signed a statement, classical liberals. There are social conservatives who've signed a statement. There are, what we might call the old anti-communists, people who believe in American leadership in the world, who could sign the statements. Plenty of people who have a pro-restraint view of foreign policy who've signed the thing. So it's meant to be, to represent that coalition. And that we've gotten some criticism for that. People say, "Well, you're too vague on this or that," but that's part of why, because we're trying to say, hey, there are going to be different flavors of freedom conservatism. One can have, in good faith, disagreements about exactly what a freedom conservatism for a conservative should think about foreign policy, for example. But where we all agree is that American interests and freedom and American citizens are best served if America is leading the world, and where in a world in which other countries are respecting the freedom of their citizens and respecting the sovereignty of their neighbors. And that's hopefully something that, whether you're on the more hawkish side or the more restraint-oriented side, you can agree with. So even though it sounds like pablum, it's actually very carefully considered to represent that spectrum. But I really do want to go back to this point about racial equality, because it's one of the things that I think, if you watch a lot of cable news or you're highly online, may seem like a head scratch. I mean, like, well, wait a minute. Does that mean you're woke? You're talking about racial equality. You're talking about the victims of discrimination. That sounds like woke to me. And I think we've had this really impoverished conversation on the right, and you could argue to some degree on the left, about racial equality, where on the right we say we're really aggrieved about everything we think of as woke. But not everything is woke. If we define woke as somebody who wants to discriminate in favor of underrepresented minorities to compensate for the discrimination that's happened in the past, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something very different. We're talking about equality under the law, no racial discrimination in terms of a legal regime, but where public policy is, where we think about public policy in the context of historical discrimination. Let me give an example. So, as we all know, there used to be, Jim Crow segregation laws, where literally we're not talking about private discrimination or individual acts of racism. We're talking about the government. We're talking about state and local governments saying, if you're black, you can only live in this neighborhood. You can only go to this school in this neighborhood, right? So, yes, that kind of discrimination is technically illegal today, but those neighborhoods still exist, right? There are neighborhoods where a lot more black people than white people live, and vice versa, because even though segregation is no longer legal, the people who grew up in that neighborhood still live in the neighborhood where their grandparents lived or their parents lived. Parents grew up, and they're going to those schools. And as a result, there's social capital and other factors that create, again, persistent inequality, that are driven by the fact that we have a system in America where the school you attend, if you go to public school, is determined by where you live. And for most of American history, where you live was determined in part by your race. And that has led to a persistent inequality in educational outcomes. So what could we do about that would be aligned with freedom conservatism? Well, it turns out there's actually a very large menu of things we can do that are race neutral, that involve allowing all Americans to go to school where they want to go to school, for parents to educate their kids using those resources the way they see fit. And some of those parents might say, I want my kids to go to a very left-wing school where they teach woke ideology. Others may say, no, I just want to go to school where they teach math and science. That's what it means to live in a free country. But that also means that we can address the inequality of education in a way that's race neutral. And there are a lot of different policies like that where we can address the inequalities that are the downstream legacy of the 20th century and prior, but do so in a way that is about treating everyone equally and not discriminating in favor of one group or another.
I appreciate you clarifying that, but I want to press on that for just a moment because the concept that we can deal with inequality in a race neutral manner, certainly through, say, advocating certain free market solutions, I'm all for it. But I also recognize that we live in a world in which there are individuals who are either themselves bad actors or possibly more commonly, to be charitable, individuals who, because of their worldview, make it nearly impossible to have a good faith argument with them about these things. I mean, one of my favorite Thomas Sowell quotes, and I'm not going to get it exact, but words to this effect, is that one of the worst idea, if he had to vote on the worst idea in policy he could think of, it would be something to the effect of everyone would be equal, but for someone out there doing something wrong. In other words, there's this presupposition some people have that inequality can only be explained through prejudice, sexism, racism. And if we could somehow effectively deal with that, we would establish some sense of perfect equality. And for this reason, the right has often had difficulty trying to find some common ground with the left over presumably what we can mostly agree are problems, because their endpoint wants to address a structural system that we're hoping to keep together because we think it's the very free market that can provide for equality. So I know that this is possibly a disjointed question, but I guess I'm saying while I'm with you in spirit of the notion of a race-neutral address of inequality, is that a realistic goal? And if so, what would it take to advance this? Maybe to put it in a different way, what would it take to have adult-like conversations about topics like race relations rather than the typical social media dumpster fire we tend to have about these topics?
Well, one way to think about this is to take race out of the equation for a second. And one thing you hear conservatives say often is, well, we're not for equality of outcomes, which is kind of what you're describing. We're for equality of opportunity. We want a system in which everyone has a fair shake at success, but we're not going to guarantee you equal outcomes. That's something you hear a lot of conservatives say to each other and to their lefty friends. Now, if you actually dig into equal opportunity, the conversation can get very complicated very quickly, because what does it mean to have equal opportunity? I would argue that to have equal opportunity, or at least some semblance of equal opportunity, we need to have a country in which everybody has access to a decent education. And this is something that John Stuart Mill believed, for example. One could argue, and hardcore anarcho-libertarians would argue, that the concept of equal opportunity is itself statist because it involves things like public schools, right? And if you're a hardcore libertarian, you don't believe in public schools. There's no government role in education at all, right? If you're a hardcore ideological libertarian. But I think the conservative who's for equal opportunity would grant that there is a role for government action in providing a good education, a high quality education to every American citizen, because education is the single greatest springboard from a struggling economic situation to a much more successful one situation. And that's that story. We've seen that story over and over again in the course of American history. So that's why education in particular is so important to ensuring that there's equal opportunity. I would argue, and many of my freedom conservative colleagues might disagree with me on this, that universal health insurance is another thing that we ought to seek if we want equal opportunity. If we want equal economic opportunity in America, we should have a country in which no one faces the threat of going bankrupt due to medical bills. And whether you agree with me or not on that particular question, people who are, say, center-left or on the progressive side would make that argument. They wouldn't, there are people on the center-left or who think of themselves or identify as members of the Democratic Party who would vote Democratic, would say, "Yeah, I'm not for equal outcomes. I'm for equal opportunity. I just think that there's a more activist role for the government in achieving it." Right. And so each of us might draw the line a little differently on that. I'm a pro free market, pro economic liberty guy. But I would say that there are certain baseline things like education and healthcare in particular, where there is a proper role for government in making sure that everybody has access to a basic high quality education and basic high quality healthcare, so that you have those springboards, so that you do have the ability to apply your work ethic and your talents to achieve everything you're capable of achieving.
So I can understand you're limiting this equal opportunity, say, for those who have been kind of left out of the system, to education, healthcare, and maybe we could add some things to the list, but we'll just keep it there for now. How what limiting principles, if any, do you have? Because I'm how do you counter the individual who takes that line of thinking? And by the way, I'll just say on the outset, I completely agree with you that once we can all agree we're for equal opportunity, that doesn't end the debate. It just starts a whole other series of debates. What exactly does that mean? But what is the limiting principle, if any, on your end, that doesn't take it back to, well, the only way to ensure adequate or equal, say, education, equal healthcare, is not only to provide that to those struggling minority communities, but it's also to address generations of racism and discrimination that have left them trapped in this. If we simply take, just to say, impoverished black neighborhoods and somehow give them equal access to to a private school that's doing well, they don't necessarily exist in a culture where they can necessarily use that to their benefit. So therefore, we've got to do more than just give them that opportunity. We've got to address these structural systems that are holding them back. And very soon you end up with the conversations about essentially making cash transfer payments to individuals based on the perception that something, and I'm not saying it's necessarily even a wrong perception, but based on the perception that is probably not fully measurable about sins that have been perpetrated on them in the past.
Well, that's there's a lot to say about this, but on the question of race specifically, the limiting principle, I would argue, ought to be the plain meaning of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says that discrimination on the basis of race is illegal. If you are engaged in interstate commerce, if you are a federally funded institution, if you are a governmental entity, um, plain and simple. Now, we have not enforced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because the courts basically in those days, which were left wing, decided that we needed to go beyond the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and engage in affirmative discrimination in favor of disadvantaged minorities, particularly African Americans, but then it was expanded to certain other groups. Not all minorities, mind you. We Asian Americans don't get counted as one of the underrepresented minorities. Underrepresented minorities is basically a racist term designed to exclude Asians. But that's pretty simple, right? If we just said no, as Chief Justice John Roberts has said, the best way to eliminate discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. If we just did that, and that was the limiting principle, we'd go very, very far. So let's just take the example of college admissions. So we had this big Supreme Court case last year or the year before, where the Supreme Court ruled that a race-based affirmative action in higher education was now unconstitutional. Based on the 14th Amendment, in their case, they didn't use the Civil Rights Act of 1964, although there was one concurrence that did cite the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the majority opinion was about the 14th Amendment in that case, which is obviously aligned with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the basic idea is that, under our Constitution and federal statute, you are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. And so that should be pretty simple. And again, we haven't enforced that. But one of the things that you hear that's so interesting is the national conservatives and their various fellow travelers on the so-called New Right say that the traditional American conservative movement, the post World War II Bill Buckley conservative movement, has been a total failure. And the reason it's been a total failure is that it hasn't stopped the woke stuff. Now, that's categorically wrong. First of all, I can tell you, as someone who who was on college campuses in the 1990s, we fought very hard against the political correctness, as we used to call it, of our time. Uh, and a lot of these same controversies came up, or similar controversies, and we won enough battles that actually died down for a while. In the 2000s and the early 2010s, things were actually, college campuses were more liberal than the broader country, but things weren't out of control, crazy, like they have been more recently. So we did win for a while, but the problem is the other side had tenure, and so they stuck around. They had a lot of institutional power. We did not have tenure. And so, they ended up getting some victories too. That's what happens in a contest of ideas. Sometimes the other side wins, and sometimes you win. So that's number one. Number two is the best way, the most enduring way to eliminate the most pernicious implementations of left-wing race ideology is to uphold the law and the Constitution, things which have been a 50-year project of the post-war American conservative movement, the hard work of the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and all these people who've gone through the conservative legal infrastructure in this country, and now are on the Supreme Court and the courts of appeals. This is how we win. And this has been a long, multi-decadal project that's now finally starting to bear fruit. And if we stick with it, we may have some really defining victories on that front that finally eliminate the worst elements of this scourge and establish that limiting principle that you're rooting for.
I would love to stay on this topic, and I might have to have you back sometime to do justice to the topic of equality and race relations. But I don't want that to dissuade us from the rest of the conversation I had considered. Anyhow, that's excellent conversation. I love those sort of departures. But since you mentioned national conservatism, I just wanted to ask as kind of an opener because, and you had mentioned this yourself, that sometimes some of the criticism of freedom conservatism statement of principles is it, and these are my words, is kind of its plain vanilla sense of, man, that's kind of a broad statement. Couldn't you have been a little bit more narrow here? And I've heard it said that there's a lot in that statement that national conservatives themselves would be totally happy with, and maybe even some prominent national conservatives would even be fine with signing. That being said, I don't think it's escaped anyone's notice that freedom conservatism statement of principles is acting as a counterbalance, say, to national conservatism's or NatCons statement of principles, if you will. And I think most people are very familiar with the arguments that conservatives, full stop, have with, say, the progressive left. But what is the concern that a freedom conservative has with the nationalist populist right?
Well, of course, with 250 plus signatories, every signatory may have a different answer to that question as to, why they signed the Freedom Conservative Statement and what quibbles, if any, they might have with the National Conservative Statement. I wrote a piece for National Review around the time soon after we launched the statement. There was a lot of commentary in various media venues, including National Review, about the statement. And one of the things that some writers said was just like what you just said. Well, these two statements are pretty similar. There are some differences. The differences are pretty minor, even trivial. And this debate is kind of mounting over a tempest in a teapot, you could say, and really not a big deal. And these are all just people who are, quibbling about think tank gigs and presidential appointments. And this is really not something that anyone should care about. And I wrote a piece for National Review responding to that argument that this was merely a tempest in a teapot and there weren't significant disagreements or ideas at stake. And again, I want to be clear. I was only speaking for myself. I was not speaking for the other signatories or for freedom conservatism itself. I was speaking only for myself. But but I would say that there are some pretty significant things about national conservatism and the broader movement that it is connected to that I disagree with very strongly, and felt that it was very important um, to create to reassemble, so to speak, and revive and revitalize that traditional conservative movement that believes that freedom is the thing that makes America great, and that is the most important part of the American political tradition to conserve. So, what are some of those things? Well, first is just that the national conservatism statement, and again, I would just warn listeners to it's not, you can't just go by the statements, but just we'll talk about the statements, and then we should go beyond the statements, because a lot of what differentiates these movements is not what is in the statements, but the broader ecosystem that these statements are connected to. So, in terms of the statement itself, the national conservatives make very clear that for them, freedom is subordinate to the national interest. Meaning, freedom is nice, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are nice, but those things should be jettisoned to the degree that they are contrary, in our judgment, to the national interest. So, who gets to decide when your freedom should be taken away? Well, I guess the national conservatives get to decide. And that's great if you're a national conservative, not so great if you're not, right? If you don't have as much confidence in their judgment as they do as to when your freedoms should be taken away. So that's problem number one, that they very explicitly say in various parts of their statement that the federal government, in particular, should be able to repress individual freedom where the national interest comes first. And look, I think that's not to say, that freedom conservatives, again, are anarcho-libertarians. There are, I think many of us would support the idea that we have an obligation to serve our country in the military should there be a war, for example, right? But the national conservatives go way beyond that and are much more muscular and aggressive about their understanding of when freedom should be subordinate to the national interest. That's number one. Number two, for me personally, is national conservatives, and again, this is when we start to get into the broader ecosystem that's about more than merely a statement or signatories to a statement. But one of the things that really animates nationalism in general in the United States and around the world, particularly in Western countries, is a deep skepticism that people who emigrate to the United States, particularly from non-European countries, are compatible with American values or Western values.
Mm-hmm.
A great example of this, perhaps the best example rhetorically of this, is Michael Anton's essay, The Flight 93 Election, where he describes the fact that one of the greatest threats to America, and particularly American liberty, in his view, is the ceaseless importation of third world immigrants who, he says, have no taste for or desire for liberty. Now, I fully grant that there may be people who come to this country who don't have any interest in liberty. You can't generalize about any group of people, particularly when you're talking about a large number of people. But if anything, the truth goes in the opposite direction. If you're immigrating to this country, particularly if you're immigrating to this country legally, the whole reason you're leaving the place you're leaving and uprooting your entire family and being willing to leave the place that you've grown up in and the relatives that you've been with and your whole support system is because you passionately believe that what America stands for is more important than staying where you are, where you feel like that freedom, that liberty, that ability to pursue your dreams is suppressed. That's why people have come to America since time immemorial. And immigrants have always rejuvenated our sense of what it means to be American what America stands for. When you're an American by choice, as Ronald Reagan used to put it, you're more patriotic often than when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. And it was most Americans didn't want to fly the American flag because they were ashamed of our country because of Vietnam and other things. And I was the most patriotic kid in my neighborhood because I understood as a second generation immigrant how lucky I was to be American, how lucky I was to be born in this country, because I could have easily been born somewhere else. And that cynicism about immigrants is really tragic. And again, I think that is not to say that we don't have a right as a country to secure our borders or determine who should enter this country. I think most of us in the freedom conservative movement are united in believing that America has a right to determine who comes into this country or not, and to do so in a way that serves American interests and the interests of American citizens. But it absolutely does serve American interests to welcome immigrants. In fact, a big part of the reason why America has been so much more successful as a country than our peers and competitors is precisely because so many talented people from around the world want to come here. And so that's one big difference between the nationalists and the freedom conservatives, is that the freedom conservatives are pro-legal immigration and the nationalists are, in general, much more skeptical about immigration of all kinds, not merely illegal immigration, but all immigration. In fact, in the National Conservative Statement, they say, a moratorium on all immigration may be appropriate. And in many other columns and op-eds and papers, you've seen national conservatives and other members of the so-called New Right make that very point, that we think that legal immigration should be curtailed or zeroed out as well. So those are two examples of things. There are others, but I think those are two really important areas of difference.
Both of those, liberty and immigration, are entire podcast episodes in and of themselves. So I may, again, sidestep what would be a very fruitful additional conversation to say that, to whatever degree some individuals out there might be arguing that these are picayune, trivial differences that the NatCons, the FreeCons are juxtaposing each other with, I think one area where a lot of NatCons would agree with a lot of FreeCons is that these differences are in fact important and that they are real, that there are distinctions. And one such individual, and I mentioned this kind of in the green room, I'd read an article recently, John Fonte of the Hudson Institute, had written in the June-July issue of Imprimis, the article, and I'll link to this in the show notes, National Conservatism, Freedom Conservatism, and Americanism. And I wanted to go through a few of, I'm not going to dissect the entire article, but I want to go through a few of what I perceive to be his main points, just to see where there may be some commonality or where there might be some disagreements. And I don't know that he actually bears the label national conservatism, but it's very obvious from the article that he's more sympathetic to that view, say, than freedom conservatism's view.
I believe he was a signatory. I could be wrong about that.
He might, yeah, I did not think to check that.
Okay, go ahead. We'll
okay.
Look it up. We're going.
In this article here, though, and I wanted to start here where he kind of, in order to make his argument, he starts with a sort of historical analysis of the American conservative movement post-1960s, say. He says the history of modern American conservatism, which can be broken into three waves. The first wave, symbolized by William F. Buckley Jr. and Ronald Reagan.
And he was a signatory, by the way, of the National Conservative Statement.
Oh, he was? Okay. Well, good. So he's more than just sympathetic. He actually is part of the NatCon crew. That first wave lasted from the mid-1950s to the end of the Cold War. The second wave, symbolized by Paul Ryan and the two Bush presidencies, ran from the 1990s to roughly the second decade of the century. And the third wave, symbolized by Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump, is ongoing. Again, that's just the beginning of his argument, but I wanted to stop there at first, because I'm curious if you would accept, because where he's going with this is he's essentially saying the NatCons are the third wave conservatives. The freedom conservatives are that second wave, the one that, again, he depicts as Paul Ryan and the two Bush presidencies throughout the 90s up until essentially we get to the era of Trump, circa 2016, say. Do you think that these are appropriate lodestars to kind of say these are emblematic of, and I know that, just to be fair, freedom conservatism encompasses a lot more than presidents and political dignitaries, but to the extent we're going to say, here are the politicians that maybe most closely embody the statesmanship we're hoping to aspire to, are the two Bushes and Paul Ryan, does that fit in that group, or is that a departure from what you think? And again, I'm asking you to speak for yourself, not all 250 plus signatories. What do you think actually represents that second wave?
Yeah. So first of all, what you're reminding me of, and by just bringing up Paul Ryan, is that one other really important difference between freedom conservatives and national conservatives is we are very, very concerned as freedom conservatives about the national debt. The national debt is in my view, the existential threat to America. We have got to tackle the national debt. We've got to do a lot of things to get the national debt under control. National debt doesn't make an appearance in the National Conservative Statement of Principles, which is interesting because for a group that purports to care about American interests, there's no greater American interest than making sure that we're solvent as a country. And yet it's not something they're really concerned about at all, at least based on that statement. And I think in reality, particularly if the national conservatives often complain about Paul Ryan, that's one of their boogeymen. It's further evidence that for them, being concerned about the national debt and the things we have to do to get the national debt under control, particularly reforming Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid, are things that they just aren't that interested in, and that's not good because my children are not going to grow up in a country that has meaningful economic opportunities if we allow the debt to continue to grow. So that's something that's really important that I should mention before I get to answer your question. I haven't read the Fonte piece. I remember when it came out just because I got a ping about it, but I haven't read it. So I want to be careful in responding to something I haven't read. But I would describe the break points or what have you a little differently. And I've written about this too, and I'll send you some of the things I've written about this so that you can include them in the show notes. But the real break point of American conservatism was 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and then the Soviet Union broke apart. Because the glue that kept that three-legged stool together from 1955, when National Review was founded, to 1989, was the Soviet Union. If you were a religious Christian, you were very opposed to the atheism and the anti-religious elements of communism. If you were pro-economic freedom and individual liberty, you obviously had those objections to Soviet communism. And if you were simply somebody who was concerned about, the American national interest in a relatively less ideological way, you understood that the Soviet Union was directly antagonistic to the United States and trying to undermine America everywhere around the world. So that once the Soviet Union fell apart, it wasn't necessarily apparent at first. It took a little bit of time for this to become apparent, but it did become apparent that once the Cold War was over, what was the glue holding these three legs into the same stool? And basically what we've seen ever since, and the rise of the national conservatives and the alt-right and the new right and whatever other names, the post-liberals, whatever other names they give themselves, really reflects is that fact that once the Cold War was over and the Iraq War, there was a time when maybe we thought that the war on Islamic fundamentalism would replace the war on the Soviet Union, the Cold War. as the thing that kept us all together. That clearly did not happen. In fact, it only accelerated the splintering of the different groups. And so that's the real break point. And since then, what we've seen is, and we've also seen over that same time period that there's not a clear break point. The fact that gradually over time, Americans have become more secular. So if you look at your generation, the millennials and Gen Z, the percentage of millennials and Gen Z who subscribe to no religion at all, the so-called nuns, is far higher than it is, say, for baby boomers or Gen X, my generation. And that means that a lot of the religious-based arguments that worked in 1960 during the Sharon Statement are not resonant for rising generations. And so cultural conservatism, in a sense, whereas it used to be about Christian values, which are in theory universal and apply to people of every race and religion, are less resonant, and tribal contests and conflicts are more resonant. In fact, there's a really interesting book called White Shift by Eric Kaufman, a scholar in the UK, who makes this point that, in fact, the countries where secularism is more pronounced are the countries where race and ethnicity based nationalism are much more prominent. And so I think those are the two trends that I think really describe the world we live in today. It's the end of the Cold War, and therefore the elimination of the glue that held these three legs together in the same coalition. And secondly, the rise of secularism, which has redefined or evolved what cultural conservatism means today versus what it meant 20, 30 years ago.
You mentioning secularism anticipates, I guess, in a sense, my next question, and while it's entirely fair to point out that the NatCon statement of principles either gives short shrift or doesn't mention the very real problem of American debt, that's something that I really do think fusionist conservatives are still one of the last remaining vestiges in American political thought that seems interested in dealing with. I want to turn to something that John Fonte points out in his article that freedom conservatives don't include in their statement of principles. And it has to do with this, the notion of secularization. And again, I'm quoting from his article. The FreeCons statement, unlike the NatCon statement, makes no reference to God. Also, whereas the fusionism that characterized first-wave conservatism hinged on the symbiotic relationship of freedom and virtue, the FreeCons statement, again, unlike the NatCon statement, makes no reference to virtue. And I bring that up because I guess it's sort of a two-part question, one in which you may have somewhat answered, which is, was the lack of reference to God, Christianity, American Judeo-Christian values, an intentional effort to try to broaden this to a, to not try to restrict this to a group that are with us in a lot of principles but can't necessarily get on board a specific religious doctrine? And then second, maybe related to that, is something I guess we haven't really talked about in this discussion, but fusionism, is holding this, the liberty and virtue hold each other, maybe not so much in tension, but that they're symbiotic, they're dependent on one another. Is there a danger or maybe a right criticism of those NatCons, or maybe not even NatCons, who would say, look, you claim to uphold both virtue and liberty, but much of your rhetoric is solely focused on liberty to the exclusion of virtue, to the exclusion of morality, such that a person could be forgiven for forgetting that virtue is also a central component of what ought to be the conservatives' ideology.
So on the question of why the freedom conservatism statement doesn't explicitly mention God, we had robust debate about that as we were drafting the statement. I actually was one of the people who favored including a reference to God in the statement, but others had a different view. And where we ended up, I actually am very much happy with, which is to the point I made earlier. If we want freedom to be conserved, it can't only be religious people who fight for freedom. all people have to want freedom. People who believe in God and people who don't. If we want religious people to have religious liberty in a country in which actively religious people who go to church every Sunday or go to even go to a church service once a month, if we want the American majority to support freedom for actively religious people, then freedom must be something that non-religious people also subscribe to. Freedom conservatism needs to be something that non-religious people can subscribe to. And so if we say that, well, if you don't believe in God, you are not a part of our community, you're not a part of our coalition, that's a suicide pact in a world in which, again, if you look at millennials and Gen Z, a majority, or if it's not a majority, it's certainly a plurality or the fastest growing group, believe in no particular religion at all. So from a purely a standpoint of having a movement in which is relevant to and embraces the interests and values of all Americans, whether you're religious or not, that's something that we really think is important. If you're only catering to and the only people you care about are people who are actively religious, then you're going to drive a lot of people who otherwise believe in our values away, and we can't afford to do that. We need every single person who believes in individual liberty to be a part of this movement if we want religious liberty to be protected. And we have a lot of Christian leaders and religious leaders who've signed the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principle, who've written essays about this very fact, about why they signed the statement, even though it contains no explicit reference to God. And I commend your listeners to those statements, and I'm happy to send a few to you, and you can choose which one you like. But there's quite a few of them, and so I find this criticism really blinkered. Frankly, I think the idea that if a statement doesn't mention God, we can't agree with it is just. I'm sorry. I find it. I could use harsher language, but I would just say that it doesn't make a lot of sense. That's the nicest thing I can say about it. It doesn't make a lot of sense because if we want America to succeed and we want America to reflect the values that we're describing in the Statement of Principles, we need as many Americans as possible to embrace those principles, whether you believe in God or not. We want, again, if you want the freedom to practice your religion, to raise your children according to your religion, then and we want non-religious people to defend that right alongside us, then we have to have a community and a coalition and a statement that's open to people who are not religious.
At the conclusion of John's article here, one more point from it. He talks about what he considers to be the key difference between the NatCon and the FreeCons. The difference between NatCons and FreeCons has to do with the character of the current political struggle against progressivism on the left. FreeCons believe we are mainly involved in policy arguments. National conservatives, on the other hand, generally believe we are involved in a cold civil war, or as third waiver Victor David Hansen has put it, in an existential war for the soul of America. Now, I want to begin by saying I know it's a very common criticism of, say, the nationalist conservatives that we fusionists are just sort of laissez-faire proceduralist, right? Everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about here. We're just going to go with the flow, sort of, not really engage truly in the actual cultural war as they would see it. That being said, I have observed that one of the key differences between my friends, who we have these robust debates around where exactly they fit in this mold, that one common trait does in fact seem to be the degree to which they see the United States as all either falling apart or as this success story that, yes, has problems and problems that might sink us, but that are addressable in a sense. In other words, are we, as the recent article by Neil Ferguson, are we all Soviets now? Are we in late stage Soviet Russia? Or is this the dawn of the bright another century of a bright American future. And obviously, a person can hold those views in tension, and maybe a little of one, a little of each. But I guess I wanted to ask, where would you, as a FreeCon yourself, see the hope of the United States in the future? Is Donald Trump our last great hope, or is there something beyond that gives you hope and rejuvenation that the American experiment can endure?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's one of the things I write about in the National Review piece about why freedom conservatism is different from national conservatism and why that matters. Is this point about is America doomed, or is there hope for America? And the national conservatives, and again, one thing I want to, just like with fusionism and the three-legged stool, there's this terminology gets thrown around. There's a lot of different subgroups within what gets called the new right, which frankly, it's not really that new. These are ideas that have been around for a very long time. It's actually a regurgitation of 1920s American conservatism in many ways, 1930s American conservatism and European conservatism.
Incidentally, the political thinker Peter Varick used to refer to the new right. He was referring to William F. Buckley's group as the new right.
They were the new right back then. Yeah. So, I think that this point is really, I think it's really important that there are, and this isn't necessarily true of John Fonte, but Michael Anton, in his Flight 93 essay, where he talks about how the ceaseless importation of third world immigrants is the existential threat to American values. It's an animating principle of many people in this ecosystem is that as America becomes more racially diverse, America is doomed, because these people who are coming to America from non-European countries don't share our values. And that's a big part of why there is a darkness in their rhetoric. That what we're losing is, as demographic change takes place, that demographic change is associated with a loss of what America stands for. And if you don't believe that, if you believe that immigrants who come here from other parts of the world are capable of being great Americans, are capable of embracing American values, of becoming entrepreneurs, of living the American dream, of working hard and playing by the rules and making life better for their communities. If you believe that, if you're optimistic about that rather than pessimistic about that, that's again, you can't speak generally about every single person in each of these factions, but that is one thrust of a lot of rhetoric on the new right, or the old right, the new old right. That's very different from that of the freedom conservatives, who are much more optimistic about new Americans to be fully American. So I think that's one real difference between the two groups. And I think that this is one thing that's actually interesting about Trump. Trump, though a lot of people in the new old right think of Trump as one of them, a national conservative. He's not. He's a nationalist on some issues and a freedom conservative on others, right? So he's very concerned about illegal immigration, for example, which so are many freedom conservatives, and so are probably all national conservatives. But he's actually very much pro-legal immigration. In 2019, when he was president, the immigration reform plan that he proposed was very much a kind of FreeCon legal immigration plan, where you say, let's reform the way legal immigration works so that we have an Australian/Canadian type system where we're bringing in the best and brightest from around the world and enabling them to stay here after they've completed their education, or after they've got a job. Let's make sure we're not educating the best and brightest from around the world and then sending them back to their countries instead of letting them come here and build great companies and work for American companies here. That's something that Trump believes, that, say, Steve Bannon does not. Steve Bannon says, no, actually, we should send them back. And he and Donald Trump have had debates about this. Steve Bannon has said, look, people will soon realize that Donald Trump is actually a moderate on immigration and that we are the hardcore immigration opponents. And he's right about that. Donald Trump is actually a pretty reasonable guy on immigration, even though his rhetoric sometimes comes across as inflammatory. And of course, when it comes to Donald Trump's views on tax policy, on regulation, he's a classic, dare I say, Paul Ryan, Ronald Reagan conservative. And so I think that there is this. I think that there. It's true that the new old right types have a much darker view of modern America than do the freedom conservatives. I think we say, yes, it's true that America is more secular than it used to be. Yes, it's true that America is more racially diverse than it used to be. Yes, it's true that there are crazy people on the left who want to take their revenge on the discrimination of the past by discriminating in a different direction. All those things are true, but particularly that last one, we can deal with that in a pro-freedom conservatism context. If we just live by the letter of the law of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, we can eliminate the excesses of the woke left, so to speak, in universities, in employment, and in government policy. We don't need to do anything fundamentally different or anything that's in conflict with the values of freedom conservatism to tackle that specific problem. When it comes to the fact that fewer people believe in God, that's a bigger challenge. I don't think if the national conservatives had a vision for how to encourage more people to be religious believers, and since in their case they're not neutral on which religions it is people should subscribe to. They're very specific about the religions they think are that Americans should subscribe to, which of course is something that's interesting in and of itself. But that, I think I welcome their contributions to evangelism and to convincing other people to be more faithful and believe in God and be more religiously active. It's not obvious to me that they have the right answer to that, because frankly their rhetoric drives people away from Christianity rather than towards it. Christianity, at least in my understanding, as someone who is a Christian, a believing Christian who goes to church, Christianity is a religion of generosity, of mercy, of kindness. It's not a religion that says if you're born in a different part of the world, you're not entitled to my kindness. It's not a religion that says that only people within a certain with a certain passport or a certain background deserve our kindness. That's not what Christianity says at all. And so a lot of people on the new old right, when they talk about Christian values, it's very focused on what happens in the bedroom and not focused enough on many of the other things that Jesus talked about when he walked on earth. And maybe they ought to think about that.
There are an enormous number of can of worms we've opened here that we don't have time to close. I'll have to have you back sometime, because it's been a very interesting and fruitful conversation. I definitely appreciate your insight into freedom conservatism and its importance in this moment. You guys have a fairly robust email that explains kind of the signatories and what they are all about and what they bring to the table. Where would the listener go to get signed up for that email? And what else, if anything, would you pitch about freedom conservatism that those who are listening to us say, man, I'm all in? What would you hope that they would do?
Well, you can learn more about freedom conservatism at freedomconservatism.org. It's pretty easy to find. It's a Substack newsletter, so it's pretty easy to sign up for in that way. On our website, there's a form you can fill out that if you want to learn more about freedom conservatism or get involved in other ways, if you want to sign the document, we are open to new signatories. If you are an active participant in the movement, in the liberty movement in some way, like you work for a think tank, you work at a university, you work at a nonprofit, you work in politics, not as an active politician, but as an activist. Those are the kinds of people that we consider as signatories. We're not looking to sign people who are practicing politicians, because we want this to be a kind of a nonpartisan activity. If we want there to be freedom, conservatism, Democrats and Republicans, ideally, and independents. And I would say also, by the way, if you're listening to this and you're somebody who thinks of yourself as a national conservative, reach out to us too, because I think, to the point we started with, we've focused a lot on the differences. But if you believe, if you're the reason you consider yourself a national conservative is because you're passionate about America's success and you're passionate about the interests of American citizens. Our argument is that it's our principles, the freedom conservative principles, that have driven that success. It's freedom conservatism that has made America great, and that is the necessary ingredient for America to be great in the future, and for all Americans to have the opportunities that we want them to have in the future. And so I hope that people who are patriotic Americans and who are animated by a love of our country will consider what we've had to say today.
Avik Roy, thank you for taking the time to come on the Saving Elephant Show.
Thanks, Josh.